Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to Raymond Montanges to introduce our speaker. If you could unmute yourself, Ray, and Martin as well, and then I think we can get started. You there, Ray?
Thank you, Lee. Yes. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. Today's speaker is Martin Hill. Martin, many of you will know Martin. Martin, a career civil servant, joined the Home Office in 1964, where he spent the major part of his working life. His family roots are English, bar one great-grandfather who was Jewish. He joined the JGSGB in 2005 to extend his Jewish ancestry researches. He found family origins in both the Netherlands and Germany. Joining the society stimulated an interest in the wider Jewish community in the Westminster area. He became a member of the council in 2013 and was secretary of the society from 2014 to the end of 2020, just a week or so ago. He wrote an article about his researches in Shemot a few years back, and this can be retrieved if you go to our website. You could find it there. Martin spent many hours over the past 15 years researching and identifying memorials at the Western Synagogue's burial ground at Brompton, Fulham, London. All the tombstones have been photographed and their inscriptions recorded, from which a reconstructed burial register has been produced. He uncovered during his researches some interesting details of mid-19th century family life, very similar to with life today in the 21st century Britain. After today's talk, there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers, which we will then return after a 15-minute break. If you have more questions and answers and receiving answers, you're very welcome. This is a golden opportunity to further and discuss your researches at the same time. Everyone is welcome. Today's presentation is entitled, Are Other People's Families More Interesting? Thoughts from the Burial Ground. Martin, over to you.
Thank you. I'll share screen if I may, so that you can see me and see the It says host disabled. Have you got my screen?
Yes, we have your screen. Your voice is a bit low though. Could you move a bit forward to the microphone?
No,
Okay.
Martin, can you try again to share your screen, please?
Yeah, just a minute. As it comes up, host disabled participant screen sharing.
It says you're a co-host, so it should be okay now. You could retry.
Done it?
Yes. Yes.
You've got my screen. Okay then. Okay, have you got the full screen?
Yes, Martin.
Okay,
fine,
good, good. I'll start with an apology to those who've joined thinking I'm going to talk about a cemetery. I will briefly talk about a cemetery, but most of the talk is about those who are buried there or may well be buried there, and their interesting lives. So I apologize if you find it uninteresting and boring. The problem for people like me is that when we start looking into something, we delve deeper and deeper until we disappear under a whole load of earth. So if you don't find it interesting, you can switch off. I won't be offended, because I'm quite surprised how many people are here. Anyway, to start, I gave a talk to the Anglo-Jewish SIG 3 years ago about my researches into the Western Synagogue burial ground at Queen's Elm in the Fulham Road in West London, and have also written about it in Shemot. This talk is not concerned with the history of the Western Synagogue or its burial ground, although I will briefly cover these in general terms to give my talk some context. The Western Synagogue was established in the mid-18th century in Denmark Court off Strand. It was the first synagogue in the West End of London. Initially, the community had burial agreements with the 3 London synagogues, but in 1813, it acquired a concession on a garden of about half an acre at Queen's Elm, West Brompton, which it purchased in 1815 for £400, which is £34,000 at today's values, which seems pretty cheap for that part of London. The plot had originally been part of an area planted with mulberry trees intended for the production of raw silk. If you have walked along Fulham Road from South Kensington, you may have been aware of a high brick wall between the Brompton Hospital and the terrace of shops at the top of Old Church Street, which were built on the site of the Owl and Keeper's House. Or maybe you have been travelling on the top deck of a bus and will have spotted rows of gravestones dominated by the trees, and the right-hand photograph here was taken from the top deck. The cemetery was regarded as full in 1884, and land for a new cemetery was acquired in Edmonton, which was opened properly in 1886, although burials continued at Queen Elms through until 1919 because of reserved plots. The photograph on the left is actually a photograph taken in 1896, and I think probably from the keeper's accommodation, because I don't see how else it could have been taken. Today, the cemetery is locked and forlorn. Many of the gravestones are broken and seriously eroded. Each time I have visited the cemetery, I have found another stone fallen and disintegrating. I would note that even at the time it was closed, upkeep of the cemetery was poor, and in the 1890s, the family of Henrietta and Louis Samuel, who were the parents of Lord Montague Samuel, who are buried there, the family paid for its restoration. The Denmark Court community was centred on the Strand and Covent Garden, working class areas with slums like Seven Dials. Many of the members came from the Netherlands and Germany and were skilled craftsmen. Over the course of the years, and as members prospered and their families grew, membership spread across Essex, from Shoreditch in the east through to Holborn, Marylebone, and south across the river to Lambeth and Southwark, and even as far as Woolwich. In addition, the more prosperous members of the community transferred their allegiance to the new synagogues built in Westminster and Marylebone. There was also an influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe. In my talk 3 years ago, I focused on some of the leaders of the community and on those who were employed by them, including people like the Nordens, who were employed as keepers of the burial ground and lived there through to 1879, and the Raphaels, who were beadles and sextons throughout the period and were present at the death of many members of the community. Today, I have drawn together some case studies which come out of my research. In my wish to correctly identify those men buried there, I recorded information from census, birth, marriage and death registers, trade directories, newspapers and other sources. Thus, I uncovered a rich vein of information about our 19th century ancestors, their lives, employment, and the organisation of society. The following notes focus on 5 families and takes us through marital and mental breakdowns, poverty, and attempts to escape it, plagues and criminality. I start with Fanny Abraham, who was the daughter of Victor, one of the leaders of the community and president of the synagogue at the time the ground was purchased. Fanny died in 1884 at the age of 75. And as you can see from her gravestone, it records sacred to the memory of Fanny Abraham, daughter of the late Victor Abraham, who departed this life October 16th, 1884. There is no suggestion that she was anything but an unmarried daughter. However, I did find a transcription and eventually traced the marriage register, which showed that in 1857 she had married a William Barrack, who is described on the certificate as a widower living in Queen Square, Bristol. In fact, his name is listed in the Gabai book, which has been transcribed by the Society. And this shows him on the left-hand picture there, and also, and I'll draw attention to it now, there's a reference to the Emdens up there who are then connected with him. However, when Fanny died in 1884, her death certificate shows that she, or alleges that she was the wife of Samuel Victor Abraham, and also that he reported her death. In fact, he wasn't her husband, he was her brother, and there's no question about that. So whether the registrar who wrote this out got the idea that he was the widower is beyond me. But therefore, don't believe anything you see, even when they're on official documents. So let's go back and find out a bit more about William Barrack. This is his baptismal register. He came to England sometime before 1844 from Eastern Europe, because he must have come before 1844, because on the 24th of November that year, he was baptized at St. John's Church, Bethnal Green, and the baptismal register gives his father as Meyer, and this ties in with his marriage certificates, and also that he was born in Ratzischow in Silesia, or at least it says in Austria, but it's Silesia. Then progressing on, we find that he was married in 1852 to a person in Bristol, Hannah Emdin, who was the daughter of Lionel, who was mentioned in the Gabai books and in fact had died in 1849. There are no records of her death in the English records. However, I am grateful to Caroline Gurney, who is researching the Jews of Bristol, for her help in uncovering what happened between 1852, when he married in Bristol, and 1857, when he married in Westminster. What we find is that he and Hannah travelled to Australia in 1853. Sorry, end of 1852, they left London, arriving in Australia at the beginning of 1853. And this is the passenger list from the ship Try, and you can see their names here. And they travelled out with some other people from Bristol called the Tartakova, who had been partners with William Barrack in Bristol in some business enterprise. Shortly after they arrived, William placed an advert in the Melbourne Argus saying that he'd come from London and that he intended to open a factory in Melbourne for the supply of cardboard and pillboxes, chemists, druggists, perfumers and others. But then on 26th of May, the same year, he placed a notice in the Argus stating that his wife Hannah had left him without any just cause and that he would not be accountable for any debts contracted by her. And a few days later, Mr. Emden placed a notice in the same paper offering to provide information about Mr. and Mrs. Barrack. So there we are. He was back in London, certainly in 1856, because his name appears in a Masonic register for admission to the Lodge of Israel, and he's given as living in Bishopsgate. Now, a little bit of background on divorce and marital issues. in 1853, there was no civil divorce in England. The Jews had been specifically exempted from the provisions of the 1753 Marriage Act, which made Christian marriage the only legal option for all others. The effect of this exemption was to put the matrimonial causes of the Jews of England exclusively in the hands of their rabbis and dayanim. Any dissolution of a marriage would have had to be dealt with under Jewish religious law. The position in Victoria, Australia, was the same, and since the Melbourne Beth Din was not established until 1864, any jurisdiction would have been exercised in London. I have not found evidence of William and Hannah's divorce, but unless the bet was written and delivered before he returned to England, the process would have been complicated by the distance separating the parties. Jeremiah Pfeiffer, in From One End of the Earth to the Other, gives an example recorded in the Pincus records of Jewish Beth Din. In that case, a sofer, Aaron Levy, appointed by the London Beth Din, travelled from London to Australia in 1830. He apparently got a return ticket for a year to obtain a bet from Samuel Levy, the husband of Mindela or Amelia Levy. In Sydney, he convened a Beth Din and obtained a bet from Samuel. Aaron Levy then returned to London, where the Beth Din reconvened, authenticated the bet, and it was executed. Aaron Levy had left London in August 1830, spent 5 months in Australia before arriving back in London in September 1831. So not an easy option nor a cheap one. However, going back to Fanny and William, one assumes that the family of Fanny Abraham and the chief rabbi who conducted the ceremony were satisfied that William was free to marry, although the certificate describes him as a widower. As I said, William and Fanny Abram were married on 18th of February 1857, and slightly less than 6 months later, on 7th of August 1857, he was admitted to Bethlehem Hospital. The admission register, which you see here, records that he was sent on the authority of his wife and that the cost would be chargeable to her brothers, Philip and David Abraham. His disorder is summarized as melancholic and has quite lost his memory. We can then turn, as it were, in the Bethlehem records to a report, which there are two by the doctors, but these are summarized in this document, which says this patient is a German Jew. He went to Australia as a tobacco merchant some few years ago and there lost almost everything he had. He returned to England and engaged in a new business and married 6 months ago. Soon afterwards, he got out of health and his memory began to fail him to a remarkable extent. He would forget the name of the street he lived in, the names of his oldest and most intimate friends, and even at times could not remember his own name. This deficiency clearly indicated mental unsoundness, and he was placed here. There's no other symptom but unnatural restlessness and anxiety about his wife's health and happiness. It is not easy to converse with him, his knowledge of English being very imperfect. Why his knowledge of English should have been imperfect since he'd been here for about 15 years, at least 15 years, is beyond me, but there we are. Anyway, he was sufficiently recovered to be discharged on November the 13th, and he was discharged back to Lisle Street, where his wife was living. We then lose sight of him again. He didn't appear in the 1861 census, although Fanny Abraham did, living with her mother. And the next record I could find of him was in 1862 and further in 1863, when he was admitted to the Stepney workhouse. And his address there is given as 49 Gun Street in Whitechapel. And he was admitted because of his destitution, and the records also describe him as a widower. After that, I can find no records of him, not even of his death. So we do not know what happened to him. I mean, I doubt very much that he traveled overseas again, so he just disappeared. Right, that's all I have to say about that sad gentleman and his unfortunate second wife. Moving on to another interesting man, Nathan Wolfe Jacobson, and the woman who was his wife, Mary Ann Isaacs. Mary Ann Isaacs' gravestone is not in good condition, but it is possible to make out that it reads, "In memory of Mary Ann, daughter of Lewis and Phoebe Isaacs of Southampton Row, Russell Square, died 9th of January 1869. As you will see, no reference to Mr. Jacobson, although she is described as Jacobson, Mrs. Jacobson, in the transcription of the burial register, and the name is given on her death certificate. Her death was registered by her father, Lewis Isaacs, and the death certificate records that she was the wife of Nathan Wolfe Jacobson, dealer in antiques, and the cause of death, inflammation of brain. They were married at Whittington Club, Arundel Street, Strand, in June 1865. It was his second marriage. They had one child, a son, Michael Wolfe Jacobson, born on 5th of July 1866. The marriage does not seem to have been happy, and in January 1867, she filed a petition for judicial separation. As I said in relation to William Barrack, a divorce as a civil procedure did not exist before the Matrimonial Causes Act 1857. And before that, the ecclesiastical courts had the sole jurisdiction over marital disputes. The new law recognized only adultery as grounds for divorce, but it provided also for judicial separation, which stopped the husband from interfering in his wife's concerns and placed her in the legal position of an unmarried woman, able to own property and responsible for her own debts. The cost of an action remained high, and in the first 10 years, there were only 1,279 dissolutions of marriage and 213 judicial separations. This is the petition which Mary Ann submitted to the court. And these papers are all on ancestry. She alleged that he was in a constant habit of abusing her in vile and reproachful terms, and of treating her with the greatest contumely and neglect. Also that in May 1866, and this was only shortly before their son was born, he had struck her on the face with several blows to the head. Reference is also made to his adultery at his house in Westbourne Terrace. The violence appears to have continued until December, when, presumably, she left the matrimonial home at 312 Oxford Street. In June the next year, 1867, the court ordered Mr. Jacobson to pay £72.19, which is £8,234 current prices, of the petitioner's cost for the deed. I've been unable to find any trace of their son, Michael, who was born on 5th of July, 1866. There is a son of Nathan Wolfe Jacobson called Joseph, who entered the Westminster Jews Free School, and we have it there. And this gives his date of birth as 5th of July 1868, so that is slightly later than his actual birth date, and that of his brother Nathan on 24th of November 1870. Given the coincidences of the 5th of July dates of birth of Michael and Joseph, it is possible that they are the same child. On the other hand, Jacobson was very lax about registering the birth of his children, as we will find a bit later. At this point, we're taking a further look at Jacobson and what emerges from the evidence about his character. He married first Rose Davis, the daughter of Daniel Davis, in 1848 at St. George's, Hanover Square. They were married again in the second quarter of 1849, presumably according to the rites and ceremonies of Jewish religion. And since the registration district was the Strand, I would assume it was at the Maiden Lane Synagogue. The General Register Office was unable to provide a copy of the second certificate because this record is currently unavailable to us. Maiden Lane records have been destroyed, and if a copy is held by the Westminster Register Office, they do not provide online copies of certificates before 1946. As the couple's first child, Abigail, was born later in 1849, I'd assume that they wished to safeguard its Jewish heritage, and a maternal link being required, a synagogue marriage was necessary. A similar double marriage occurs in another case I'm going to be talking about, so we'll come to that then. After the death of Mary Ann Isaacs, Jacobson married a Rebecca Levy in 1869. There were two children born to Jacobson during the period of this marriage, both in 1871. Rosa, or Rose, born on 6th of November 1871, and the birth certificate gives her mother's maiden name as Hart, not Levy. And the second child was a Nathan Wolfe, born earlier in 1871, and the GRO reference for that gives the mother as Levy, so clearly the child of Rebecca Levy. Rosa died in 1875, tubercular meningitis, and is buried at Brompton. And Nathan died in 1897 at the age of 26 and is buried at Plachette. The gravestone stating, "Dearly beloved grandson of Joseph and the late Rose Levy." I can find no record of the death of Rebecca Levy or of a divorce. Finally, Jacobson married an Annie Wingard in 1874. They had three children, Charles, Rebecca, and Julius. Their births were not registered until 1881, after the death of their father, and so have been added to the earlier registers in manuscript, appearing as both Jacobson and Wolfe Jacobson. Jacobson himself died in Hastings in 1881, and his death was reported by the landlord of his boarding house. Annie survived him, dying in 1940, aged 85. Let's now look at his other activities. In 1851, the census records that he was living in Tottenham Court Road and was occupied as a watchmaker. We meet him the following year, 1852, at the Old Bailey, when as Nathan Wolfe, alias Nathan Wolfe Jacobson, he was tried with Thomas Lawrence on an indictment for burglary, breaking into the dwelling house of Leopold Redpath and stealing a vase valued £20, which is £2,800 now, and on the second count of receiving the same. They were found guilty and sentenced to be transported for 10 years. In 1853, he petitioned the Home Office for early release, and the report by the chaplain at the Portsmouth prison said he brought in a statement that the business now carried on by his wife would come into his hands. It was signed by his father-in-law, or so described as father-in-law, Isaac Jacobson. Father-in-law appears to be the way they used to describe a stepfather. And it was included promises of employment signed by several respectable persons. Well, one of these respectable persons was Charles Marks, a hatter, my great-great-grandfather, and I'm not sure that everyone would have regarded him as respectable, least of all his wife. The report included statements of his conduct, and it seems that whilst in Portland Prison, his general behaviour was good, but that he was a trafficker. Just see that written in there. Sorry, anyway. So he obviously wasn't that good a person. Presumably he trafficked in something like tobacco. The petition was rejected, but he was released on licence on 21st of July 1856. At that time, transportation, well, they'd been sentenced to be transported, and transportation was abolished in 1868. At this time, very few people were being transported. There are other references to Wolfe and Jacobson in the Old Bailey records, including one involving his brother, well, a stepbrother, because his stepbrother, Mark Jacobson, gave evidence. And when he was questioned, do you know Jacobson of Tottenham Court Road? He said, I know Wolfe of Tottenham Court Road. He is a relation of mine. My master has a customer named Jacobson of Tottenham Court Road. He is my brother-in-law, my stepbrother. So I think Jacobson was a fairly dodgy character. And as a jeweler, he no doubt practiced on the side as a receiver of stolen goods. And the last thing I really want to say about him was where he was covered quite widely in the press was in 1880, when he was having land, he purchased land attached to the Whitefield Chapel in Tottenham Court Road. This is sometimes called Whitfield Chapel and is now the American Church. He had purchased the burial land there. The land was part of the disused burial ground. Human bones were removed without a license, and he was charged under the Burial Act with indecently disturbing the bones. It was reported the jury had found that the remains were human, but they were not prepared to say they were disinterred in an improper and disturbing manner. In fact, the land had been purchased by Jacobson in 1863, and his first attempts to develop the site failed when he was convicted and fined for disturbing human remains, and an injunction was granted forbidding building work on the site. When he died intestate in 1881, his father-in-law, Charles Wingard, together with his grandchildren, Charles, Rebecca, and Julius Jacobson, were parties to a legal action against Annie Jacobson, née Wingard, his widow. The case was not settled until 1819, when the site was sold back to the trustees of the chapel. And I've seen a legal opinion, a modern opinion, which had looked at the evidence, and it can be assumed that the legal action was taken really just to sort out the ownership of the land and how it should best be dealt with by the executors. So that, in a sense, is the end of my comments on Nathan Wolfe Jacobson, who I think is an interesting person, because the more you uncovered, the nastier he appeared to be. If we can go on, we come to the Loftman family, Louis and Rachel Loftman, and this is a typescript from the Western Synagogue burial accounts, which are held in the London Metropolitan Archives and date from the 1880s onwards. So cover both Brompton Road and also their cemetery at Edmonton. When I looked into this child of Mr. Loftman, I found that it was a daughter, Annie, who had died at the age of 8 months in 1885 at White Hart Street and St. Martin's in the Fields. She died of bronchitis and dentition. The 1881 census showed the family living at Lichfield Street and his occupation as a tailor, although the death register gives him as a publican. Both Louis and his wife Rachel were born in Poland, and at the time of the 1881 census, they had 3 children. Going further back, I found that Louis was living in Birmingham and was the son of Jacob and Rebecca Lofman, and they'd come to England from Poland in about 1860 as there was a daughter, Phoebe, who was born in early 1861. I then discovered that, like Jacobson, Louis and Rachel had been married twice. The first time was at the Birmingham Registry Office on 31st, on 31st of August 1876. Given that they were aged at 19 and 17, they could only have been married with parental consent. But as a witness was Kate Harris, Rachel's mother, you can assume that this was given. And also elsewhere it says that at that time, Joseph Harris, the father, was deceased, but that doesn't appear on this certificate. Again, I applied for the second certificate, but was told that it would be held by the local register office. So I went to Judith Joseph, the archivist for Birmingham Hebrew congregation, and she told me that their registers showed that on 17th of January 1876, they were married at the synagogue in Birmingham. And she was suggested that this would have been to ensure the Jewish heritage of any child. And in fact, their first child, Ada, was born in Chesterfield on the 11th of May 1877. So that surmise seems to be correct. So far straightforward, but further researches for the period after 1885 revealed that between 1881 and 1885, the family had been in South Africa where a further child was born, Jane, in 1883. Maybe that Annie, who we see had already died, was born there, but as there is no registration for her birth in England, I'm assuming that she was born in South Africa. I found also that Rachel Lofman had a further child, Alex, born on 7th of November 1885 at 40 Nottingham Place, Mile End, and that he had died on the 14th of June at the age of 8 months, the cause of death being diarrhea. As you will see, his grandmother, Kate Harris, registered his death. At that time they were living 14 Ellen Street, St George in the East. The 1891 census shows no sign of the parents, but Jane and Rose were pupils at the Jews Hospital and Asylum in West Norwood, and Ada, their eldest child, and Sarah were living in Marylebone with a couple named Koch, who were described as the Koch's grandchildren. Seems a bit odd. Further research revealed evidence of the children's schooling. In 1885, when they were living at Berwick Street off Piccadilly, they were admitted, the 3 eldest children were admitted to the Westminster Jewish Free School in Hanbury Place. And it says there that the last school attended was in Birmingham, which suggests that they did not go to South Africa with their parents, remained with their grandmother in Birmingham. Subsequently, Sarah and Jane went back to the Westminster Jewish Free School when they were living locally a year or 2 later. Records show that when Rachel Lofman went to live in the East End in 1885-6, the children went to school there, Rose to Lower Chapman Street School, and the others to Settle Street School. Looking to see what happened to Louis and Rachel in the mid-1880s, I thought perhaps they had returned to South Africa, as there were no leads, but my attention was drawn to the Jewish Board of Guardians records at the Hartley Library at the University of Southampton, and I was able to obtain copies of documents dealing with the Loftman family, which come from the records of the Jewish Board of Guardians. The paper shows that the children were abandoned or deserted at the St. Luke's workhouse where their mother committed suicide. On 16th of May 1890, the Board of Guardians made an application to the workhouse for the 3 younger ones to be transferred to the Jews Hospital and Asylum at Norwood under the PR or Poor Relief Acts, and for their grandmother to keep the elder child, a girl aged 13. A separate record notes that Kate Harris, a widow of 116 New Oxford Street, was the grandmother of Ada, Sarah, and Rose and Jane. That she was formerly living with them and their mother at Mulberry Street, Commercial Road. It was also noted at the bottom of this document that it was believed the husband to be in Sydney. Subsequently, the children were transferred through the workhouse system to the Hospital and Orphans Asylum at Norwood, and the other ones, the older ones, to their grandmother, and that their grandmother was paid by the Board of Guardians 5 shillings a week towards their support. Sad for the children, but there does appear after this to be some light in their lives, because Ada and Sarah married and had children, and Rose and Jane lived together, firstly with their grandmother and then together. And in fact, Rose and Jane didn't die until 1969 and 1970 respectively. What about Louis Loftman? There is a record of his arrival in Sydney from Melbourne on the ship Nemesis on 19th of January 1886. Well, there's L. Loftman, who came from Spring Hill, and this, given his age, which is correct, this is likely to be Louis Loftman, as Spring Hill is a part of Birmingham. His life in Australia does not seem to have been a particularly happy one. He spent time in and out of prison, and this is his prison record with a picture of him. And it appears to have been, you know, minor offences, false pretences, similar sort of minor thefts. The sentences meted out to him weren't exactly pleasant ones. One of them was for hard labour, and it says that hard labour for the first week of each alternative month of the second 6 months, and of each alternative month for the last 6 months of detention in solitary confinement. So the Australian prison system seems to me to have been even tougher than the English one was at the time. He didn't leave prison there until 1897, but he subsequently married and hopefully had a slightly happier life. And he died in 1929 in Cheltenham, Victoria. Right, I'm probably running a bit late, so I'll skate over the next one, which is Nathan's, who were a family living in Soho at the time of the 1854 cholera outbreak. And 4 of the family died in this. Louis Nathan's wife, one of his daughters, and 2 of his grandchildren. And I couldn't, at the time I first did this, find what had happened to them, but I subsequently found, these are their tombstones, but I subsequently found that Louis Nathan, Mrs. Brodie, that's his daughter, Miss Brodie and Master Brodie had travelled to Australia in 1855. But in fact, what I also what I also discovered was that an elder a son, Morris, had gone to Melbourne before the cholera outbreak in 1852. And so it seems to me possible that the family were always planning to go to Australia, and it just so happened that the elder son went before the cholera outbreak and the others followed as soon as they had managed to get themselves together afterwards. Louis Nathan, the father, he died shortly, really a couple of years after arriving in Australia. Esther, his daughter, Esther Brodie, she remarried and presumably lived happily ever after. Morris, the son, he lived until 1893, and he left to his sister Esther pictures of his parents and other effects to his nephew, Marcus Brodie. Marcus died in 1926. So hopefully their life in Australia was rather better than their life living in Soho. Now, the final person I'm going to talk about are Anne Solomon. This is her memorial at the Brompton Cemetery. It's not, in fact, a gravestone. It is a memorial and it's attached to the wall. And what it reads is sacred to the memory of Anne Solomon, youngest daughter of Sarah and Moses Russell, who departed this life at Jersey, Wednesday, the 1st Tevet, 5608, corresponding to December the 8th. She was aged 28 years. She's in fact buried at the Westmount Cemetery in Jersey, although the tombstone there has fallen over and is no longer legible. Now, why should the Russells put up a memorial at Brompton? This is not clear apart from the fact that her mother, Sarah Russell, had died just over 2 weeks earlier on 20th of November 1847, and Moses presumably planned to be buried in the cemetery, although he had not reserved the plot. Anne had married Asher Solomon in February 1847, and the event is recorded in the Great Synagogue marriage registers. So she died just 9 months and 2 weeks after her marriage. The death certificate gives the cause of death as rupture of the blood vessel. The 1851 database entry on JCR UK for Asher Solomon, and which is now being updated, suggests that she had died in childbirth and that there was a daughter, Esther. The person who had provided this information had clearly not consulted the Jersey death and birth registers and may have made an assumption, because she died a little over 9 months from her marriage, and that there is in the English GRO registers an Esther Solomon born in Q3 1847, that this was a child of an Asher and Anne Solomon. But the GRO register gives her mother of this Esther as formerly Hart, and the district is Eastry, near Sandwich in Kent, so nowhere near Jersey. I have it on good authority that rupture of a blood vessel would not be caused by childbirth. However, her death clearly caused some friction between Asher and her family, because the Jewish Chronicle carried an advertisement on 7th of January 1848 from her brother Israel Russell, deeply regretting the sorrow that has been occasioned to our family by a report having been circulated with respect to the cause of the death of your late lamented wife, my sister, and having made the most searching inquiries into the truth of such report and finding the same to be founded in error and yourself entirely exculpated. So we don't know what all this is about, presumably never will do, but it suggests, I think, perhaps that Israel was doubly upset losing his mother and his sister so close together. Just before I finish, a couple of asides really on other members of the Russell family, because they were a well-known family. Samuel, one of her brothers, he died in 1857. He was a dealer living in Sheerness, presumably supplying victuals to the Navy. He died in an unfortunate accident received on board HMS Colossus, and here's a picture of Colossus, or at least a sister ship of Colossus. He apparently fell a distance of upwards of 30 feet down a companionway and struck his head on a spirit cask. And he is buried at the Jewish cemetery in Chatham. I only hope he didn't fall because he'd imbibed too much of the spirits in the cask. Samuel had a daughter who died in childbirth in January 1845. She was aged 23. At the inquest, which was widely reported in the UK press, at her inquest, her parents stated that they had not been aware of her pregnancy until the morning before her death, or there seems to have been some doubt about this. Her father said that her final words were, "Oh, Father, you have had enough to trouble you without this. Oh, the villain that deceived me." The younger sister, I think was probably Sarah, who was aged 15, gave evidence that she had purchased a pennyworth of arsenic for her sister to kill mice, which she had delivered to her. Medical evidence testified that they were of the opinion that she had died from the effect of arsenic. The jury decided that Esther had died having swallowed arsenic, but how or by whom administered, there is not sufficient evidence. The jury were unanimously of the opinion that a great want of attention towards the deceased had been shown by her parents and family. In fact, actually at the time, the evidence also shows that her mother was pregnant with something like her 20th child. So I suppose her mother was rather preoccupied with the younger children and her pregnancy. Finally, just as a final aside, Henry Russell, the composer, who composed a lot of popular songs of the 19th century, including A Life in the Ocean Waves, is buried at Kensal Green Cemetery. This is his cemetery. This is his grave stone, and it was erected by Hannah de Lara, who was his second wife, and it's based really taken from one of his most popular songs, The Old Armchair. I tried to find a recording of this, but I couldn't find one with music attached. I have somewhere here a recording of it, but I don't know if I can actually get it to play. Or whether can you hear that? Can you hear that?
No, Martin,
can't.
no, nothing.
No. Oh, well, we'll leave it. I'm sure I bored you enough now. Anyway, to conclude, when I agreed to give this talk, I thought quickly about a title, but since then, working through the material and thinking about my own family, I think that probably most of us have forebears who are as interesting. But I hope that having taken you through divorce, separation, the Old Bailey, criminal courts, transportation to Australia and so on, that I have given you quite an interesting picture of our 19th century ancestors. And I also think that probably people today have very similar lives, just lived in slightly different circumstances. We don't have the workhouses, we have the welfare state, but life is pretty tough for a lot of people, and a lot of people survive or make a living out of dubious criminal activities. So anyway, I hope you've all enjoyed this talk, and if you've got any questions, please ask them.
Thank you, Martin, very much. Very interesting, well researched. For the benefit of attendees here, how many stones have you actually recorded, and where are the records for these stones? People may wish to click on.
You mean the records which I've got,
Yeah.
I've put together? Well, they actually sit on my desk most of the time. I was intending by now to put a final version in the library at our library at Society of Genealogists, but given lockdown, that hasn't been possible. But I'm just rewriting an introduction, which will include much of what's in this talk. And then as soon as, hopefully soon after the library's reopened, I will lodge the record there. But it's, at the moment, it's about 3 volumes of about 150, 200 pages each. Because there's a record of all the tombstones and their inscriptions as far as they are legible. And then I have reconstructed the register of burials, which was transcribed by Hymanson in the 1890s. And I have gone through that. He did it in alphabetical order. I put it back into date order, which is probably easier to find if you know when your ancestor died. And that covers not only those who are covered by the inscriptions, but also everybody else as well. So there are well over 1,000 names on that. And then I've got another volume, which is a summary of all the census returns.
Will there be a link on our website for this?
Well, I mean, that depends how we decide to do it, because I can put it all onto the website. Once I've finished it and tidied it all up, I can put send a copy to the webmaster and get it put in the members corner.
Fine, thanks. I just wondered, any members here today, any attendees here today, recognise any names? I know you only showed a handful, but they think they may have relatives buried down there. I think Hazel Dacres has a Nordens down there. Am I right, Hazel? Where is she?
Yes, Ray, I've actually got 2 cousins here today, one from New York and one from London, but who wouldn't normally attend a genealogical meeting because they, unlike me, are directly descended from the burial ground Nordens, as I call them, Jacob Norden and family. And I was rather hoping that Martin might think back and tell them what he remembers of his Norden researches in relation to Brompton.
Well, I did cover them in my previous talk, which obviously wasn't recorded. And I could send them. I'm happy to send a transcript of that talk. I mean, I can send it to you if you like, and you can send it on to them.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Was it also in Shamotte, Martin?
No, much of what was in it had previously been in such.
Yes, I remember that.
But nothing about really about individuals like the Nordens. I mean, the Nordens are a very interesting family because they were keepers of the burial ground from, I think, probably the time it was opened in 1815, 1818, right through to 1879. And I think there were three successive generations who were the keepers. So it was a very close connection between them and the burial ground. And obviously, quite a few of them are buried in the burial ground.
Okay, so are there any questions for Martin? Feel free to put your hand up in front of your face. Doreen, do you want to start us off? Oh, can't hear you, Doreen, but it doesn't look like you're muted. Oh, there we go.
I'm on mute. Is there any additional information, Martin, at the Metropolitan Archives than you have transcribed?
Yes, I mean there is the Western Synagogue have put what little remains of their records in there, and but you have to have permission to see them. But it's got quite an interesting thing because it's got all the rules and regulations which cover the burial ground as well as the synagogue more generally. But there is also a book with things like receipts for payments made to people like the Nordens and the Raphaels for their work, you know, that they were paid, you know, 5 shillings a quarter or whatever it was. So yes, there is not very much though, but it's quite interesting. If you've got anybody buried there, it's well worth looking at.
Who do you have to get permission from?
From the president of the synagogue.
Of the Western Synagogue?
The Western is the Western Marble Arch Synagogue.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Doreen. Joanna, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I just want to put a comment in that it just shows that there was a lot more movement of people to and from Australia than is supposed, and that there's quite a few people that went there not for criminal reasons, you know, didn't get a ticket there for criminal purposes, but because they wanted to go of their own volition and things like this. Because I know from the village where I lived in Oxfordshire, some people went to Australia because they wanted to get the heck out of that village and make a new life for themselves, and they weren't criminals.
I think Joel Levy has an example of that as well, where I think everyone was assuming the family must have had some brushes with the law, but in fact, if I recall, Joel, he was looking after the prisoners, you know, working at the prison, nothing to do with flouting the law. So,
I mean, if I can come in, one of the Charles Marks I referred to, his brother Mark Marks, he went out to, I think it may have been New Zealand rather than Australia, but after a few years there, they came back to England and continued in their business in England. So that there was a two-way movement. But I would also say that there are cases of where people went out to Australia because they wanted to get away from their wife or husband in this country, and they went out with the partner because when they got out there, they could appear to be man and wife, and nobody asked any questions. I mean, admittedly, people did that even within this country. They would just move around the corner and nobody knew them. So you didn't need to go through the effort of a divorce if you didn't want to.
Joel, did you have a comment on that?
Just a few comments. Now, sadly, my direct ancestor also, I just want to say for Martin, just some connections to Bristol. So unfortunately, in 1837, my ancestor was a criminal. He was basically a fence and in possession of stolen goods, and he had a terrible time on prison hulks, and then he went to Australia, and then he reoffended. So he, instead of being there for 14 years, he was there for 28 years. So he did offend, sadly enough. But what I just wanted to say to what caught my eye about movement of people around the country is, Martin, at the beginning of the first family, you showed the marriage record in Bristol. And a name that caught my eye was, I think he was a witness there, and I know he's probably a big machi, very involved with the synagogue and the community, was Joseph Rothschild. Just what caught my eye is that he had 10 children. One of his daughters married someone called Hill Sittner from the Birmingham area, and another of our members of the society, Miriam Margulies, she's loosely related to that family. And Joseph Rothschild's youngest daughter, Selina, married a guy called Wolf Phillips from Newport, Wales, whose first wife was part of my Welsh Bloom family. But it's very interesting just to say is that a lot of the Bristol family, certainly from Joseph Rothschild's family in Bristol, moved around, especially to Birmingham. So anyone who's got Bristol and Birmingham connections, you may have come across that family name.
Okay, thanks, John.
Can I interrupt?
Adrian, I think, oh, Okay, Ina, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, I did want to ask a question. I have my great-great-grandfather buried there. My family was the Kish family, who were servants for Shamus at the Western Synagogue for a long time, right from the earliest days. And I went to the cemetery about 1996, something like that, and took some photos of the various Kish graves. One of them, my great-great-great-grandmother had a tree growing out of the grave at that time already. I went back about probably 6 or 7 years ago. We had a chance to go with Raymond to that cemetery, and I noticed that these stones were getting more and more and more illegible. And I wondered, what are the earliest photos that are on record of the inscriptions on the graves?
It was about 2006, 5 or 6, round about then, of when we took most of the photos. I've taken subsequent ones, but really only where the earlier ones weren't clear.
Mine aren't clear either, I'm afraid.
No. I mean, it's very difficult to enhance them in any way to
Illegible, yeah.
Yeah. It's sad, but I mean, it's just the stone they're made of. It just disintegrates in the London pollution.
I was shocked to see how quickly they disintegrate.
Yes.
Maybe London for you. But can we go to next question? I think we have Adrian next. Then I'm going to go to Naomi and then George Abrahams. So, Adrian, you want to ask your question?
Yes, good afternoon. I'm descended from the Russells, and I want to know if there are any other Russells there at all, please.
Yes, well, there's it's I'll just look up for you. I'll look in my list. But certainly Israel is buried there. Mm-hmm. The son of and the brother of the one I was talking about.
Anyone else?
Well, the Israel.
Yeah. How about Martin? If you send me the details later, I can forward them to Adrienne, if that's okay.
Yes. That would be fine. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, basically, it's Israel, his wife Elizabeth, and his parents Moses and Sarah. They're the ones who are buried there. Mm-hmm. Okay. But I'll check that for you and let you have them.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very kind of you.
If we can go to Naomi Cream, if you can unmute yourself.
I came very late to Martin's talk, in fact, in the last slide, because I'd forgotten about it.
Oops.
And I just wanted to say that when I originally went in the 1960s, I think it was, the stone of my ancestor, which was Solomon iron, was upright. But when I went back a few years ago with Martin, it was fallen down, and he identified it, but it was fallen down. And I think that his son or son-in-law his grandson was buried there. I don't know if Martin remembers the Diane Weed Lion. You took us there.
Yes.
I can't see you on this screen, I'm afraid. But it just shows that these things were very temporary, weren't they?
Sadly, some of those stones have been damaged by the builders who are doing work at the Brompton Hospital, and carelessness, and the Western didn't seem to be too bothered about it. And Yes, it has fallen into disrepair there. I don't think they'll ever do anything about it. What will happen, Martin? Do you know the latest there from the Western about the cemetery?
No. I think they just don't have the money. I mean, that's the problem. Unless you can get heritage lottery funds. I think one of their problems, unlike say Willesden, there's no way of making the site secure. So if you got lottery money to do it, you'd have to have it open to the public, and there's no way you could have the security even to let them in on the occasional basis, because people can just shin over the wall, and if you drew too much attention to it, you'd probably discover that what remains would just be knocked down by vandals, sadly.
Okay, thank you for that. So the next question is George Abrahams, then I promise I'll go to Michael War. Sorry for missing you. You must be on my second screen, Michael, but if we can go to George Abrahams.
Thanks to Hazel Dakers. That's why I joined you, to listen to Martin's interesting presentation. My middle name, by the way, is Norden. Question to Martin is, the records of the Western Synagogue burial grounds, have they been digitized?
No.
Anybody want to do the job? Always looking for volunteers. I'm sure the Western would welcome you.
Well, there are no records. I mean, the thing about it is the Western have no decent records about the people buried there. They have a website, which is the Western Charitable Foundation, I think. And there it purports to tell you, you can put a name in and it will tell you which plot it is. But in actual fact, this is spurious. It's based upon a list which was prepared in 1890 something by Hyamson, who did a walk around the cemetery and wrote down the names that he could read at that time, which shows you that even in the 1890s, a lot of them were illegible. And he just put row 1 or row 10, which is very difficult to measure up. And in fact, you can't even work on his rows. When they wanted to put the information on their website, I think they went to Charles Tucker, who got hold of Hymeson's list and gave them what he purported to be the references for each of the gravestones. But in actual fact, it doesn't hardly cover anybody. So it's not really worth the sort of, I wouldn't say paper it's written on, because it's obviously not written on paper. So that's the problem. There is, I would like to claim that what I've got is probably the most comprehensive. And I have sent it to the synagogue, but I don't think they're interested.
Thank you, Martin.
All right, if we can go to Michael War. Sorry to keep you waiting, Michael.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. First of all, I'd like to thank Martin very much for an email he replied to me 48 hours ago, which has nothing to do with my question. You might be interested to know my great-great-grandfather was Abraham Solomon, and his brother was Asher Solomon, who got himself into trouble with the Russell family over the death of his wife in Jersey in the last part of the talk of Martin. I got to know about this because I was tracing my maternal grandmother's line back, and I can do it right through to Abraham Solomon and Asher Solomon's father, who was Lion Solomon, who died in 1858. Asher Solomon had quite an interesting history in later life. He got married twice more. I learned this from looking through Doreen Berger's work of her cuttings out of the newspapers of the 1860s and 1870s. Asher Solomon got married, first of all, to, I have to look it up, an Isaacs. I can't quite remember straight off. It's disappeared. Here we are. Here we are. First of all, got married to Catherine Isaacs, and then he got married again after her death to late in life to Mazoda Alouf, a Sephardi Jewess, and they went down to live in Hove. So it's very, very interesting how the connections all build up. And that's all my comment was. I was the one, unfortunately, who presumed rather quickly that Anne Russell had probably died in childbirth. And I rather thought the issue of blood was placenta previa, which causes a hell of a lot of bleeding after a woman has died in childbirth. I'd worked it out because 9 months after their marriage, but we don't know really the cause. And Esther Solomon came in. I didn't actually do the Esther Solomon from somewhere in East London. I'd rather thought it was another Esther Solomon, but I hadn't got any proof from any death certificate or any birth certificate to which Esther Solomon it was. That's basically it. I don't know what Martin thinks about all that.
Well, I think it actually shows you how difficult it is to do any of this research, and that really it would be better if all our research was done by 3 separate people at the same time, and then you could compare the outcome, because you might then arrive at the truth. It's so difficult, and also I think one has to be really careful not to make assumptions. I mean, the talk I gave, you could make a lot of assumptions about why people, why William Barrack went off his head. Perhaps he felt guilty. It was all lies. His whole life was a tissue of fabric, a fabrication, and he just couldn't cope with it. He married this nice girl in Westminster, and everything seemed all right. But every time he woke up in the night, he thought, "Oh my God, they're going to find out that I'm bigamous." You don't know. You could sit and write a work of fiction, and that would be fine. But if you're doing genealogy, you've just got to be completely sort of cold about it and ignore all the assumptions you can make and say these are the facts.
Yes, I'd absolutely agree with you. I always say usually you've got to do it by finding 3 different ways that you can actually prove it.
Yes.
This was basically making an assumption about 5 years ago, and I realize now it's probably an incorrect assumption.
Well, I didn't know it was you, and I wouldn't criticize you for making those assumptions.
Doesn't matter. I've learned a lot from you.
Good, good.
Okay.
It makes all my hours worthwhile.
All right. Thanks, Martin and Michael. Next question's from Daniel Morgan Thomas, Vice Chairman, and then we'll go to Susie Folks.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Martin. It's a really interesting talk. I suppose it's more of a reflection than a comment, really. You mentioned someone being buried in Plashet at one point. And I thought it's an interesting parallel for those of us who know it on the other side of London. I've been there, I have to confess, I've never been to the Brompton, but it does make me want to, when things are a bit safer, get on the top deck of a bus going down the road so I can peer over, because it looks like it'd be fun and worth doing. But I think it's an interesting parallel with, in a similar way, that you could make lots of interesting stories and connections. And I've occasionally stopped at, by some grave that is next to what, my ancestor's grave. It's frustratingly totally eroded, but you can see right next to it is a grave you can read very legibly, and you think, here is a person who has an interesting life you can make a connection to, rather than my poor ancestor whose cheap grave is worn to nothing. And I think, Raymond mentioned about what will happen to it. And I think the sad thing is that, a lot of burial societies and synagogues, if they still exist, and they don't for all of the cemeteries that we have even in London, don't either have the interest or the money to keep them going. And I think it's hugely important, the sort of work you've been able to do, and even, looking at things, photos or records you had a few years ago, because in 10 or 20 years' time, possibly even those will be illegible and people won't be able to make the connections. And sadly, I wish we could have projects like the big project they've got in Willesden now, where they're pouring money in and they're getting the security beefed up and having a heritage centre built there. But unfortunately, unless anyone has a few million down the back of their sofa, I don't think we're going to get that for all of the places our ancestors are buried in. And I think it's really worth people coming together, even for just people you take an interest in, because a lot of the people buried in the cemeteries won't have any descendants in this country. They might not have descendants at all. And clearly you've demonstrated a lot of them have lives that are really worth researching and recording. So I just wanted to thank you for that. I think it's a salutary lesson for all of us to take an interest in the people we find in cemeteries, whether they are relatives or not.
Thanks, Daniel. Any comment on that, Martin? Or I heard an or two, but or should we move to Susie? I think we'll move to Susie's question, if that's okay.
First of all, thank you very much indeed, Martin. It was absolutely fascinating talk. Partly about people going to Australia. I've got Benjamins who were not criminals at all, and they went off to Australia and came back and were very successful business people, I understand. We have got criminals as well, and they're more fun to research, actually, I think. But anyway, the other thing I wanted to mention was to Joel Levy. You mentioned Hill Sitner. Would you know anything about his? I've got a query of that family. If I emailed you about, there's a thing in Doreen Berger's book about thanking for condolences for his sister, and who is also the mother of Julius Roggely, but it makes the siblings about 27 years apart, and there's a bit of a query there. I don't know whether you would know anything about that. You're muted.
I'm going to just pull up the tree now and just see. So you're looking for whose siblings are you looking for? Hills.
Well, you mentioned Hill Sitner.
Yep.
Who I've got down as being born in 1827, dying in 1910.
Yep.
And he thanks for condolences for his sister Esther Sitner, and who is, and the same thing, Julius Roggely thanks for condolences for his mother Esther Sitner. It's just that Julius Roggely's daughter Priscilla married one of my ancestors, that's all. But I'm mystified how, I mean, 27 years apart, I mean, it's possible, but it's quite a lot. That's making her 17 when she had him. I mean, he could be a bit younger, I suppose. I know she died in 1878. I don't know whether you have anything about that at all.
I haven't got much of her.
They were from Waskin.
Have you been in touch with Miriam Margulies? Because that's her, I think she's connected to the Roggely.
Said that, that's interesting. I will make a note of that. I didn't know she was till now. Okay. Thank you very much.
They also had a South African connection. Part of the Roggely's also went to South Africa and the Sitners.
Yes, we've got all there. The Krauses, who are my ancestors, when the Roggely's were related, they were all in South Africa. Thank you.
There you go.
Okay. Any other questions for Martin? I think I saw Nigel Nathan's thumb go up, but I'm not quite sure if that was a question or not. If you would like to ask a question, Nigel, if you could unmute. If not, feel free to stay muted. Anyone else have a question? Oh, Nigel?
No, I don't have a question.
Okay.
I was just leaving a message.
All right, thanks.
I have to go now.
Okay, thanks,
Thank
Nigel.
you very much.
All right, bye now. And Doreen?
Yeah,
Oh.
Out of interest, has anybody had the death certificate of Leanne Solomon, who I think it was, who died, and we're not quite sure about what happened to her? Would not the death certificate help to clarify it? That's one thing, is one question. And the other is just a statement that how just looking at the headlines, births, marriages, deaths, and what is printed about people doesn't tell us what is hidden about them. And what it says publicly about people, there may be a lot more to their lives than we can ever find out just by reading the headlines about them. That's the thing that strikes me.
Okay.
Was that a question? Was that a question, Doreen? Was that a
No,
question?
that was just a comment about how
Sorry.
much more interesting the actual lives of people are, apart from just the headlines about what happened to them. But I'm just wondering, with the death certificate of the Anne Solomon, would that help us to just find out what was said she died from?
Yes, it was just the blood vessel. That's all it says.
That's what it said. Okay.
Yes, and I asked Anthony Joseph, who gave me a long spiel about blood vessels and aortas and what, but he assured me that it was nothing to do with childbirth. It was just one of those unfortunate things, and if she had it today, she'd die.
Right. Thank you very much, Martin. Very good talk. Thank you.
Okay, so it's now Hazel time, but I'm going to go to Hazel Atlas first and then Hazel Dakers second, if that's okay. Hazel, sorry for keeping you waiting.
That's okay. Just a general observation about people moving around. My third time's great-grandfather was a Moses Sampson, who was born in the East End and lived in New Street. And he and his wife, Hannah Jacobs, went to New York in 1861 with 3 of their children. The fourth one, I can't find out what he did in New York at all. They had another child, the fourth child was born there. I can't find out when they came back, but certainly by 1865, they were back here because the 5th child had been born here. Can't find them on the 1871 census, certainly on the 1881 I can find them, but certainly in the 1870s, he also got into trouble, a few petty things, but he ended up serving 10 months hard labor in Clerkenwell House of Correction on a perjury charge in the case of willful perjury in the case of a bastardy summons, which was quite unusual. By this time, he had about 8 children. Why he wanted a father anymore, I have no idea. But certainly his life went downhill after that, and he died in 1893. So the fact is that I think with all of us have got a lot of life was tough in the 19th century, and it certainly wasn't the good old days. The other thing that Martin mentioned in his talk, which was very enjoyable, was about Henry Russell right at the end, saying that he was married to a Hannah de Lara, and I have a Hannah de Lara as my 3rd time's great aunt. I wonder if it's a relation. Any ideas?
Well, I think if you look up Henry Russell on Dictionary of National Biography, I think it probably gives her parents there.
Oh, I've got her parents as Joshua Rodriguez de Lara and Esther Vigorano. So yes, I've got those down. So, but I'll check on that. Thank you.
Yeah. Also, Wikipedia has quite a bit about him.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks.
Okay. Other Hazel?
Mine are 2 comments really triggered by a lot of the earlier discussion. It strikes me that an awful lot of the reason for migration, and particularly from England to the colonies, was economic migration, trying to make a better life. And if you think about it, South Africa, California, Australia, gold rushes in the 19th century, there were obviously a lot of them hoping to make it big time. In contrast, gravestones. An awful lot of the ones in my family seem to be that very soft stone, can't remember the name of it, that just sort of crumbles. But if you look at 1 or 2 richer, wider members of my family, they clearly had much harder stone for their memorials and tombstones, and they tend to survive far better. I think it's in part an indication of how well off people were, or their relatives were, who put up the stones.
Or how much they wanted to spend.
Well, that's yes.
But I think also what's interesting, because you'll find them at the Brompton one. Sometimes they must have spent an awful lot of money, because they had very ornate ones which climbed up and were brick and everything else. But in fact, it weathers, the bricks fall off, and you see that in fact the whole thing was just a Potemkin village. You know, it wasn't had any substance whatsoever. It probably cost them a lot of money, and some shady undertaker obviously offered to to provide it. I think it's just interesting. But as you say, you know, the Rothschilds and people spent a lot of money. If you go to West Ham, they've a great mausoleum for one of the Rothschild wives. Yeah, if you've got a lot of money, it lasts. You know, you use granite and you pay a stonemason a lot of money to chisel out the names.
Okay, any more questions, Gina? If you could unmute.
Unmute Gina.
Okay, sorry, always forget it. Thanks, Martin. Very interesting talk, especially as Raymond and I were very involved in it with the photography many moons ago. I've just got a simple question to ask. One of the documents that you showed mentioned St. Luke's at the bottom of it.
Yes.
What was that, please?
St. Luke's is Shoreditch, Clerkenwell. It's St. Luke's church is in the Clerkenwell Road, or is it?
Oh, it was
whatever. It's a continuous. It's the workhouse. So it's
right, yeah. So it was a workhouse.
Yes,
right.
I mean at the moment now St. Luke's is owned by London Symphony Orchestra, but the sort of vestry house is still there in a side turning just by the church. So
Okay.
it's in Clerkenwell, Shoreditch.
Okay, thank you. The reason I'm asking is that the name struck a bell, and I searched on my computer and I found that, I don't know how many years ago, I've transcribed all the people who were cured in a hospital or an asylum that was called St. Luke's. I've got a complete list here. It looks like I've done it at the National Archives, because there's a reference number. I've extracted all the Jewish names, and I just wondered if there was any connection.
No, St. Luke, they would name hospitals after St. Luke because he was a doctor.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
All right. And I think
Joanna.
the final question from Joanna.
Thank you. Do we still have to go via the president of the synagogue, Western Synagogue, to get the archive for the Plashet Cemetery?
No, different cemetery. Plashet's United Synagogue.
United.
Sorry?
The Plashet Cemetery comes under the United Synagogue's wing.
Yes.
This is the Western Synagogue. Martin's cemetery is the Western.
Yeah. Yeah, because we discovered that one of my ancestors the marriage was formalized by one of Ina's ancestors. And then and the paperwork I've got says something about them buried up at Plashet, you see. So there's a funny mixture between the two.
The Plashet, if you go into United, if you want to know whether they're buried there, you can have a look on the United Synagogue website, which has graves there. And if you put in Plashet and the name, it may come up. I mean, it's not beyond the possibilities that it won't come up. But you could ask the United Synagogue Burial Society.
Phone up Bushy Cemetery, that's their head office, or even Waltham Abbey. They'll have the records there.
Well, Waltham Abbey.
Yeah, or Bushy. I always go to Bushy. I deal with them first of all.
Bushy
Cemetery.
Cemetery. Okay, right. Thank you.
Did I see one last question from Michael? I thought I saw a finger raised, but
yeah, Michael. Yeah.
Michael War. If you could unmute Michael.
Unmute Michael. Unmute yourself. No. Make a good ventriloquist. Unmute Michael.
I am now.
Well done.
Okay.
It was Gina Marks got my interest just now about St. Luke's. It's also the parish around Old Street. One of my ancestors, Alfred Solomon, was born there in 1837. It would be very interesting to find out if there's any more Solomon names in your list from St. Luke's area.
I can have a look.
Okay.
I can have a look, Michael.
That'd be lovely. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I thought that was on the list that Gina was just mentioned she'd transcribed, but on Martin's list, I see.
That was it, yeah.
Okay. We can hook you up after the meeting, and
Thank you.
perhaps you can look for, was that Solomon's names on that list, Gina?
Any old Solomons, yeah.
Maybe one or two. Yeah.
Okay. I have Solomon and Solomon direct ancestors myself, actually.
Okay.
That's a common name.
All right.
No, I'm sure they're cousins. They're close cousins, Raymond. Yeah. Stay positive. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm probably going to hand over to Ray to close the meeting, but before we do that, I'd just like to give Martin a huge round of applause for answering all our questions and today's talk. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Raymond, do you want to mention next week's meeting and close this one? Is that right?
I was going to mention it to you, Lee, because you were going to do some housekeeping, you said at the beginning, but you never got round to it. So did you want to mention it all now? Or
okay, well, just next week's meeting is Dutch and Sephardi Special Interest Group, so 17th of January, and Marjorie Cohen will be speaking on Genesis and Indian childhood. So do join us for that. It'll be the usual DNS suspects, so Raymond will be running the show, but I'm sure that Hazel, Gina and co will all be around for anything Dutch and Sephardi. I don't really have very much housekeeping to do. That was just me telling people about recording the meeting and that sort of thing. But I think we've all deserved our cup of tea now. Hope you enjoyed today's meeting, and I propose we will see you all on another Zoom sometime soon. So thanks everyone.
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
Very much.
Take care.
Can I quickly jump in before we go? Last couple of words.
Yeah, sure.
Just expanding January's list, please. Doreen will be speaking on the 24th. She will be giving a specialist talk on the Davis family of Petticoat Lane. And the end of the month, Jane Hantman will be talking from Berlin to Manila. Don't know any more about it than that. So we have a couple of good meetings coming up before the month's out.
Signed in for next week, I think.
Okay, go and put the kettle on. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye. Take care, everybody.
And you. Bye.
Keep safe.
Keep well.
Thank you.